Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 7 of the most disturbing true crew stories ever submitted to this channel. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning authentic horror over cheap jump scares. All right, let's begin. The report said he was drunk. 4 vodka tonics, it said. Over 2 hours. At my bar. I want to be clear about something right at the start. I never poured that man a single drink that night. Not one. I know, because I remember every face at my bar on a bad night. And that night was the worst night of my career. And it's been 11 years. His name was Daniel, 41. Traveling alone, cabin on deck 7, the kind of guy who tips in cash and says thank you like he means it. I'd served him 3 nights running. Beer, mostly. Never more than 2. So when the incident report came down from the company, calling it an alcohol-related fall, intoxication, unfortunate accident, I read it twice, standing in the crew mess, with my hands shaking, because I knew it was wrong, and I knew exactly why they'd written it that way. Fast, clean, closed, no investigation, no lawsuit, no headline. Here's what actually happened. Around 9 that evening, Daniel came up to the bar, not to drink, just to talk to me. He looked rattled. Said a man from another cabin had been following him since the port stop that afternoon, showing up wherever he went, standing too close, saying things that weren't threats exactly, but weren't nothing either. He asked me who he should report it to. I walked him down to guest services myself. I watched him file the complaint. I saw the officer type it into the system. I saw the confirmation number print out on a little slip of paper that Daniel folded into his shirt pocket. 4 hours later, he went into the water off the aft deck, and by morning, that complaint was gone. Not resolved, not filed away. Gone. I asked the same officer about it 2 days later. Casual, like I was just curious. And she looked at me the way you look at someone who said something dangerous, in a room with cameras. She said there was no record of any complaint. She said it with her eyes somewhere over my shoulder. That was the first time I understood this wasn't clumsiness. This was a decision somebody made. I kept quiet for a week, telling myself I needed more information before I said anything, which is the lie people tell themselves right before they decide to say nothing at all. Then I found out who the other man was, the one Daniel had reported. He wasn't a passenger. He was listed on the crew manifest as a security consultant, contracted through a firm the cruise line used for what they called risk management, which meant he wasn't a stranger they could quietly disembark at the next port. He was one of theirs. That's the second thing that changed everything for me. Because if he was just some drunk tourist who'd gotten handsy with another guest, this is a sad story about a bad night. But if he worked for the company, then the company had a reason to make sure nobody ever connected him to what happened to Daniel. And they did. 2 weeks later, I got moved off that ship. My supervisor called it a promotion, a bigger bar on a bigger vessel, better tips, better cabin. I took it. I want you to sit with that. I took it. For a long time, I told myself that was the end of it. Then, about 3 years later, working a different ship, I overheard 2 officers from the original vessel talking in the crew bar during a shift change, and one of them mentioned a name I recognized. The same security contractor. Different ship now, different year, but the same pattern. A passenger, alone, reporting harassment, and then an accident before the complaint went anywhere. I didn't say anything to them. I just stood there with a rag in my hand, pretending to wipe down a counter that was already clean. That was the third turn, and it was the one that actually scared me, because it meant this wasn't one bad night I'd witnessed. It meant a system was working exactly the way somebody had built it to work. I started keeping notes after that. Dates, ship names, half-remembered details. Nothing that would hold up anywhere. Just a private record because I didn't trust my own memory not to soften the edges over time. About a year into keeping those notes, I got a call from a lawyer representing the cruise line. Not about Daniel. About a wrongful termination claim from an entirely different crew member. Someone I didn't even know, and the lawyer wanted to ask me some general questions about workplace culture on the ship where Daniel died. I answered carefully. I didn't mention the complaint. I didn't mention the name. And at the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said something like, "We do appreciate loyalty in this industry. It tends to be remembered." I hung up and sat in my cabin for a long time. The fifth turn came from something small. I finally looked up the toxicology report, the actual one, not the summary in the incident file. A friend who'd moved into ship medical sent it to me, without really understanding what she was handing over. The blood alcohol number in the final report didn't match the number in the original lab notation. Someone had adjusted it upward, enough to turn borderline sober into legally impaired. I stared at that page until the numbers stopped meaning anything. I want to tell you I did something heroic with that information. I didn't. I saved it. I told myself I was building a case. Really, I was just scared. And saving things felt like doing something without the risk of actually doing anything. Then, 6 years after it happened, I met his sister. Not on purpose. She'd tracked down former crew from that voyage one by one, working through a list she must have built from old employee rosters, and she found me on a stopover in Miami, waiting outside the terminal gate like she'd been standing there for hours, because she had been. She didn't yell at me. That was almost worse. She just asked me, quietly, if I remembered her brother. I said yes. She asked if he'd really been drunk, and there it was. The moment I'd rehearsed 100 different ways in my head over 6 years, and every rehearsed version fell apart the second she was standing in front of me, with his exact eyes. I told her part of it, not all of it. I told her about the complaint, the harassment, the fact that he'd been stone sober at my bar that night. I didn't tell her about the contractor's name, or the pattern I'd heard whispered on another ship, or the altered lab report sitting in a folder on an old hard drive. I told myself I was protecting her from something unfinished. Really, I was still protecting myself. She started digging after that conversation, and for a while she'd email me updates, hopeful ones, then increasingly worried ones, about records she couldn't access, and requests that kept getting denied, and a private investigator who suddenly stopped returning her calls. Then the emails stopped altogether. I don't know if she gave up or got frightened off, or just ran out of money to keep fighting a company with more lawyers than she could ever afford. I never found out, and that not knowing sits somewhere in my chest every single day. Here's the last thing, and it's the one I think about most. A few years ago, I ran into someone from that original ship at an industry job fair. Someone I barely remembered, and she asked me offhand if I'd heard what happened to the security contractor. I said no. She said he'd died of a heart attack, quietly, in his 50s, working for the same company the whole time. No consequences, no reckoning, nothing. Just a man who lived out a normal life, carrying whatever he carried, and it never once caught up with him. That was it. That was the ending the world decided to give this. No trial, no confession, no relief for anyone except him. I still work bars on ships. I'm good at it. People like talking to me because I don't offer opinions I haven't earned. I haven't had a drink myself in over a decade, not because I have a problem, but because I watched a man get blamed for one he didn't have, and something in me decided I'd never give anyone a reason to write that sentence about me. I still don't know where Daniel's sister is. I still have those notes on an old drive I'm too much of a coward to send anywhere that matters. Some nights, pouring drinks for strangers who'll forget my face by morning, I think about the version of me that walked her to guest services and watched a slip of paper print out and fold into a dead man's pocket. I think about how easy it would have been right then to make sure that complaint never disappeared. I didn't do it. I've had 11 years to live with that, and I expect I'll have a lot more. Okay. I need to just say this out loud to somebody, even if that somebody is just a recording, because if I don't get it out of my head, I think I'm going to lose it. I work housekeeping on this ship. I've been on contract for, almost 8 months now, and none of this was supposed to be my problem. I just clean cabins. I restock the little shampoo bottles and I make the beds with those hospital corners they train you on. And that's it. That's supposed to be it. So there's this woman, Marisol. She worked my rotation, same deck, and about 6 weeks ago she got hurt. I was there. I want to be really clear about that. I was there. I saw it happen. She was pulling one of those linen carts, and the wheel caught on the lip of the service elevator, and it yanked her arm and she went down hard on her shoulder and hip, and I helped her up. I walked her to the infirmary myself. I remember, because I had to leave my cart in the hallway, and somebody almost tripped on it and yelled at me. And then she wasn't on the schedule the next week. Which, okay, fine. Maybe she needed to recover. That happens. People get moved to light duty or sent to see a doctor on shore. That's normal. I didn't think anything of it at first. I swear I didn't. But then I needed to look something up. This is embarrassing. I was trying to see if I had any unused leave days banked. So I pulled up the crew portal, and her name was still sitting right there on the manifest roster, like she was still active, still assigned. Except when I clicked into her file, it said she'd voluntarily disembarked. Voluntarily. Weeks before the date I actually watched her get hurt. I sat there for like 10 minutes just staring at the screen. Because that's not how it works. You don't disembark before the injury that supposedly made you leave, unless somebody went back in and changed the date. Which, why would anyone do that, unless they wanted it to look like she was never actually hurt while she was still under contract? So I started looking a little more, just quietly, just on my breaks, and, okay, this part actually scared me. The incident log for that day, the one I remember, the one with the linen cart, there's no entry, nothing. It's like it happened, and then somebody reached in and just erased it. Not redacted, not marked confidential, gone. Like it was never typed in the first place. And then I thought, wait, if they touched her file, would they have touched mine too? Since I was the one who walked her to the infirmary, I would have had to log that I left my post. So I checked my own timesheet from that day, and my hours were different, not by a lot. Just enough, like 15-20 minutes shifted around. Enough that on paper, it looks like I was doing normal rounds the whole shift. No gap, no detour to the infirmary, nothing. I emailed HR. I know. Probably not the smartest move looking back, but I didn't know what else to do. I just asked a real vague question. Something like, hey, I noticed a scheduling discrepancy. Can someone clarify? And I got a reply back a few days later saying the person who normally handles those requests was no longer with the company, and my message would be forwarded, and nothing, no follow-up, ever. So then, this is the part where I really started shaking. I went back further. Older manifests, older crew rosters, just names I recognized from when I first started. And there's this pattern. There's this same wording over and over. Voluntarily disembarked. Contract concluded by mutual agreement. Dates that don't line up if you cross-reference them with the old duty rosters I'd saved on my own phone, just because I'm the type who screenshots everything. I don't even know why. Habit, I guess. And I found out, this made me feel sick. Some of these people got severance. Which sounds good, right? Sounds like maybe it was handled fairly. Except the payments went to family members back home, not to the crew member directly. Which either means the company was being generous to next of kin for some reason, or it means the person wasn't in a position to receive it themselves anymore. And I don't want to think about what that means. I really don't. But I can't stop thinking about it. I tried to find Marisol. Actually find her. Like, call her, message her. Her number's disconnected. I asked a mutual friend from training, someone who kept in touch with her family a little, and she said the family moved out of their apartment not long after Marisol supposedly went home, and nobody really knows where they are now. Maybe that's nothing. Maybe that's just people moving for a totally normal reason. I keep telling myself that. Then a couple days ago, my supervisor pulled me aside, real casual, real friendly, and said something like, hey, just a heads up. IT flagged some unusual login activity on your account. Probably nothing, but maybe don't go digging through old crew files, company policy and all that. And I hadn't told anyone I was looking. Nobody. So either they're watching the system logs really closely, or they're watching me specifically, and I don't know which one is worse. And right after that I checked my own personnel file, just to see, and there's a note on it now, a performance review flag, dated from this month, saying I've had attendance inconsistencies. I have never had an attendance issue in my life. I show up early. I stay late. Everyone knows that. So that's That's not a review. That's the start of a paper trail. That's the beginning of them writing the story they want to tell about me, before anything's even happened to me yet. I found something else too, and I still don't totally understand how I found it. Honestly, it was luck, a mistake. There was an old shared drive folder, left over from a former IT contractor, somebody who apparently got let go himself, and inside it were backup copies of records, actual originals, injury logs, timesheets, before anybody edited them. Untouched, which means somebody else, before me, already knew something was wrong. Somebody else was already trying to preserve the truth. And when I looked up his name, just to see if I could maybe reach out to him, thank him, ask him what he knew, there's barely anything. No current job listed anywhere. No social media updated in over a year. Like he just kind of stopped existing publicly the moment he stopped working here. And then last night, I don't even know why I did this. I went back into my own old medical records from way early on in my contract, from my first few months, because I twisted my ankle once on a wet stairwell. Nothing major. I barely thought about it since. And there it was. Same pattern, same wording. My incident had already been quietly closed out and backdated too, months ago, without me ever noticing, without anyone ever telling me. Which means I wasn't just some housekeeper who stumbled onto somebody else's cover-up. I was already inside it. I was already one of the names on a list I didn't even know existed. I've been walking around this ship for months, thinking I was the one uncovering the truth. And the whole time, I was already one of the people they'd started erasing. So now every night, before I go to sleep, I go through and I save everything. Every schedule I've ever worked, every shift, every incident, every little screenshot, and I email them to myself, and to one other account nobody here knows about. Just in case something happens and somebody, someday, needs proof that I was really here. That any of us were really here. I got the call on a Tuesday morning, while I was still in bed in my tiny cabin 3 decks below the waterline, and the cruise director's voice on the phone had this forced brightness that I should have caught right away. He said I was moving up, that I was going to be the lead in the big production show, the one with the aerial rig and the 12 costume changes, the one that closes out every cruise with a standing ovation. I remember sitting up so fast I hit my head on the bunk above me, and I remember laughing, actually laughing out loud, alone in that little room, because I had wanted this since I was 19 years old, doing community theater in a strip mall back home. I didn't think to ask why. That's the first thing I have to be honest about. I didn't ask why the spot had opened up, because when you're 26 and someone hands you the thing you've wanted your whole life, you don't interrogate the gift. You just take it and run. The lead before me was a woman named Priya, and I'd worked beside her for 8 months. She was the best dancer on that ship, maybe the best I'd ever danced next to, the kind of performer who made you raise your own game just by standing near her in rehearsal. She'd been distant that last week, quieter than usual, and I told myself it was exhaustion, because the schedule on those ships eats you alive. It wasn't until I was already 3 days into learning her old choreography that another dancer, a guy named Marcus, who did lighting cues from the wings, told me quietly in the crew mess that Priya had filed a complaint against one of the senior entertainment officers. He said it like he was handing me something heavy and didn't want to hold it anymore himself. I told myself the two things weren't connected. I told myself people get reassigned on cruise ships constantly, that it's the nature of the business. Contracts end, routes change, staff rotate through the fleet like cargo. I held on to that story for longer than I'm proud of. The first show I did as lead, I got a standing ovation in the main theater, and backstage after, half the cast hugged me, and I felt like I'd arrived somewhere I'd been trying to reach for 7 years. I called my mother from the crew deck and told her I finally made it. She cried on the phone. I didn't tell her about Priya, because at that point I still didn't fully understand what I was standing on top of. Then I started hearing pieces. A wardrobe girl mentioned that Priya's transfer had come through unusually fast, faster than any reassignment she'd seen in 3 contracts. Normally these things take weeks, paperwork, approvals from 2 different departments. Priya's had cleared in 4 days. I filed that away and didn't look at it directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun. The ship Priya got sent to was one everyone in the fleet joked about. A shorter, choppier route through rougher water, fewer port days, older cabins for crew. People called it the punishment ship, half joking, but everyone knew there was truth under the joke. When I heard that's where she landed, something in my stomach turned over, but I had a show that night, and the show doesn't wait for your conscience to catch up. Around 6 weeks into my run as lead, the senior officer she'd complained about, a man everyone called Chief Denard, started showing up to my rehearsals more than he needed to. He'd stand at the back of the room with his arms crossed and nod along like he was proud of something he'd built. I told myself he was just supportive of the show. I told myself a lot of things. One night after a late rehearsal, he caught me alone by the crew elevators and told me I reminded him of himself when he was young, hungry, willing to do what it took. I laughed it off, because I didn't know what else to do with a sentence like that. But it sat wrong in my chest for days. I started asking around more carefully, quietly, the way you do when you're afraid of the answer. A stage manager who'd been on the fleet for 11 years told me, over drinks in port one night, that this wasn't the first time a rising performer had gotten a fast promotion right after someone inconvenient had been moved out of the way. She said it so casually, like she was describing weather patterns, and that casualness scared me more than the information itself. I found out that Priya hadn't just been transferred. She'd been demoted in title too, moved from principal dancer to ensemble, a title change that would follow her paperwork for the rest of her career in this industry. A quiet mark that HR departments on other ships would see and draw their own conclusions from, without ever knowing the real story. I tried to reach her. I got her old email through a mutual contact and wrote something clumsy, something that was probably more about easing my own conscience than actually helping her. She wrote back one line. She said, "Congratulations, you earned it." And I read that sentence probably 30 times trying to figure out if it was sincere or if it was the sharpest thing anyone had ever said to me. I kept performing. The show got better, tighter, and guests started requesting it by name at the excursion desk, asking which nights I'd be dancing. I was becoming, in the small self-contained world of that ship, something like a minor celebrity, and it felt good in a way that made me hate myself a little, because I knew what the foundation was made of, even if I couldn't prove it. Then another dancer joined the cast, a young guy fresh off his first contract, eager the way I'd been eager, and I watched Chief Denard take an interest in him too, the same kind of interest, standing too close during notes, finding reasons to keep him after rehearsal. And I understood, watching that unfold from the outside for the first time, exactly what had probably happened to me, from angles I'd never seen. Favor dressed up as opportunity. Opportunity built on somebody else's silence. I didn't say anything. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights. I watched it happening to someone else, and I stayed quiet, because saying something meant admitting what my own promotion had actually been. 6 months into my contract, corporate sent auditors through for a routine review, the kind cruise lines run periodically to check labor compliance, and somewhere in that review, Priya's transfer got flagged, not because of what happened to her specifically, but because her paperwork trail didn't match normal HR timelines. It became a data anomaly before it ever became a person's story again. I got pulled into an interview room with a human resources rep from the corporate office, a woman with a laptop and a very careful voice, and she asked me questions about the timeline of my promotion, dates, conversations, who told me what and when. I answered honestly, finally, after months of not looking directly at any of it, and watching her type my answers into a spreadsheet made the whole thing feel smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because it was reduced to bullet points. Larger because I realized this had happened enough times across the fleet that someone had built a spreadsheet for it. Chief Denard was quietly removed from the ship within 2 weeks. Not fired publicly, not with any announcement to the crew, just gone one morning, his cabin cleared out, replaced by someone new who arrived like nothing had happened. The company handled it the way companies handle these things. Contained, controlled. No ripples reaching the guests upstairs, who were still applauding every night at my show. I thought that would feel like justice. It didn't, not really. because Priya was still on the punishment ship with a demoted title on her record, and nobody offered to fix that, and nobody offered her my role back, because by then I'd already logged 6 months of guest reviews with my name in them, and the business side of the company had decided that continuity mattered more than correcting an old wrong. I finished that contract and signed another one, because I still loved the actual dancing, the actual moment on stage when the lights come up and your body knows exactly what to do before your mind catches up. But something had shifted in how I watched everyone around me, every promotion, every sudden opening, every young dancer getting pulled aside by someone senior for a private word. I started seeing the machinery instead of the magic. 2 contracts later, I ran into Priya by accident in an airport in Miami, both of us between flights, both of us still in the industry but on different fleets by then. She looked older in a way that had nothing to do with age. We got coffee at a gate kiosk and talked for maybe 40 minutes, and she told me she didn't blame me specifically, that she understood how the system used people like me without needing us to be villains, that the villain wasn't the guy who got the role, it was the structure that made getting the role and losing your voice into the same transaction. I didn't know what to do with that generosity. It felt heavier than anger would have. I left the industry about a year after that conversation. Told myself it was for other reasons. Better pay on land, wanting to live somewhere that didn't move under my feet. But if I'm honest, it was mostly because I couldn't watch another young performer walk into a rehearsal room, glowing with the same excitement I'd had, without wondering what they didn't know yet about how they got there. I don't watch those cruise entertainment specials anymore. The ones that air on travel channels showing dancers in sequined costumes under stage lights, with guests cheering in the dark. My family doesn't understand why I changed the channel. They think I'm being modest, avoiding my own old footage out of humility. That's not it. It's that every time I see a young performer taking a bow under those lights, I think about who didn't get to take that bow instead, and whose silence paid for the applause. The first report I filed was routine. Cabin Block C, Deck 3, crew quarters. Forced entry, no theft. Occupant not present at time of intrusion. I logged the time, the door number, the state of the lock, scratched around the keypad, not broken, which told me whoever did it knew what they were doing. I sent it up the chain the way I'd sent up 100 reports before that one. I didn't think about it again until the following week, when I logged another one. Same block, different cabin, same scratch pattern around the keypad. I want to be clear about how I write these things, because it matters later. I don't editorialize. I record time, location, method, evidence, and I forward it. That's the job. So when the third one came in, 3 weeks running, same corridor, I didn't write, "Someone is stalking the female crew on Deck 3. I wrote what I saw. A pattern of unauthorized access, consistent methodology, escalating frequency. I flagged it as escalating because that's what the data showed. I expected someone above me to read that word and do something with it. What I got instead was a call from the port office telling me my reports were creating unnecessary alarm in the file system. That was the exact phrase, unnecessary alarm. I remember writing it down on a sticky note because it felt like something I'd need to remember exactly, word for word, later. I didn't know yet how right I was. I pulled the camera footage for the corridor to attach to the fourth report before I even filed it, because I wanted the evidence locked down before anyone could tell me to stop. That's when I found out the cameras on that specific stretch of Deck 3 had been logged as malfunctioning for 6 weeks. Not down, malfunctioning. There's a difference in how those get recorded, and someone had chosen the word that doesn't trigger an automatic maintenance ticket. I checked the maintenance system myself. No ticket had ever been opened. The cameras worked fine. I watched myself walk past them on a live feed 20 minutes later, waving my badge, just to be sure. So I went around it. I requested the archived footage directly from the network drive instead of the live monitoring desk, thinking maybe it was a labeling error, a lazy tech who didn't want to climb a ladder. What I got back was a folder that had been accessed and modified 3 separate times in the last month, always within a few hours of one of my intrusion reports. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything with it. I want to say I felt afraid. What I actually felt was that particular kind of calm you get right before you understand you're not going to like where this goes. I brought it to my supervisor anyway, because that was still the process, and because some part of me still believed the process existed for a reason. He didn't deny any of it. He told me, almost gently, that this needed to be handled informally from here on out, not in the incident system. He said the word informally, the way you'd explain a rule to a kid, like I was the one being unreasonable for wanting it written down. I asked him what informally meant in practice. He said talk to the department heads directly, off the books. I asked him whose idea that was. He didn't answer that one. 2 days later, a woman from the galley staff caught me alone, near the crew mess, and asked, without any preamble, if I was the one who'd been filing the reports. I said yes. She looked at the door behind her twice before she spoke again, and told me it wasn't the first time this had happened to her, and that the first time she'd reported it to someone in HR, and nothing had come of it except that her hours got cut the following month. She wasn't accusing anyone by name. She didn't have to. I wrote none of it down in front of her. I wrote it all down the second she walked away, in a notebook I started keeping that wasn't company property, because I already understood the company property version of events wasn't going to reflect what actually happened. That's when I started pulling badge access logs myself, instead of requesting them through the proper channel, because the proper channel had become a place where things went to be quietly refiled as nothing. The pattern in the logs matched the pattern in my incident reports almost exactly. A badge swipe into the crew corridor at the same 3 to 5 a.m. window, every time, on the nights matching my reports. What I hadn't expected was whose badge it was. It wasn't a random crew member. It was a supervisor's override credential, the kind issued to exactly 4 people on the ship for emergency access, the kind that doesn't require a personal key code, just a fingerprint that resets every contract cycle. I took that to HR directly, because at that point I'd stopped believing my own department was going to do anything with it. The woman I spoke to listened to the whole thing without writing a single note, and then told me, very carefully, that personnel matters involving supervisory staff were outside the scope of security's authority, and that if I had concerns, I should submit them through proper channels. I asked her what channel that was, given that my channel had just told me to stop using it. She didn't have an answer for that either. Nobody on this ship seemed to have answers, only the same 3 sentences rearranged, depending on who was saying them. So I went back further than the ship. I pulled the man's personnel file, which I still had access to, because apparently revoking that access hadn't occurred to anyone yet, and found something that made the calm I'd been holding on to finally crack a little. He'd worked for the same parent company before, on a different vessel, 3 years earlier. There was a note in his file, a single line, referencing a resolved personnel matter, no further detail, and a transfer request dated 2 weeks after that note that had been approved same day. Same-day approvals didn't happen for anything else in that system. I'd requested a schedule change once and waited 11 days. His transfer took hours. Somewhere around here I stopped thinking of this as a security problem and started thinking of it as something the company had already decided the outcome of, long before I ever filed my first report. That realization didn't feel like a twist so much as a floor giving out. I went to the ship's safety officer, the one position technically outside the normal chain, thinking maybe that mattered. He told me, without much interest, that pursuing this further would mean the company had to admit their vetting process had failed to catch a repeat offender, and that admitting that opened them to liability going back years, across multiple ships, and that nobody, not him, not me, not anyone with a paycheck attached to this, was going to be the one who opened that door. He said it like he was doing me a favor by being honest. Maybe he was. I told him I'd go outside the company if I had to. He said that was my right, and then mentioned, almost as an aside, that contracts in this industry were shorter than people like to think, and that reputations followed you between companies faster than paperwork did. I didn't take that as a threat in the moment. I've had a long time since then to decide that it absolutely was one. I kept documenting anyway. Nights, times, badge pulls, the woman from the galley's account written in my own hand since it existed nowhere official. I told myself I was building something airtight. Something nobody could bury, the way they'd buried the last one. I emailed a compliance line listed in the employee handbook, the one that promised confidentiality, using a personal account instead of company email, attaching everything I had. I got an automated confirmation and then, 4 days later, a notice that my contract review had been moved up unexpectedly, 6 weeks early, for what was described as a routine restructuring of the security department's staffing model. Routine, that word again. 3 nights after that notice, it happened again, same corridor. I know because I was the one who found her in the hallway afterward. And I know because for the first time in a month of filing reports about doors and locks and access logs, I was filing one about a person instead. I won't describe what I wrote in that report. I've spent a long time trying not to describe it to myself. What I'll say is that it was the first report in that entire month where the company didn't tell me to stop filing it. They didn't need to. By the time they finally decided to act, formally, visibly, with statements and a very careful press line about an isolated incident, it had already happened 5 times that I knew of, and God knows how many I didn't. I quit 2 weeks later. Not because they pushed me out, though I think they would have, eventually, on some other pretext with a tidy word attached to it, but because I understood that I could file every report correctly, follow every procedure, document every badge swipe and every malfunctioning camera, and none of it mattered against a company that had already decided which truths it could afford to know. I didn't feel like I'd failed exactly. I felt like I'd been used as a formality, something the file needed so it could later say a concern was raised and addressed, without anyone specifying what addressed meant. I work a different job now, nothing to do with ships or corridors or badge systems. But I still check the locks on hotel room doors before I sleep, every single one, the deadbolt and the little swing latch above it, sometimes twice, running my fingers along the frame the way I used to check for scratch marks around a keypad. My wife asked me once why I do it in places that have never given either of us a single reason to worry. I told her it's just a habit. That's not entirely true. It's the last piece of the job I never got to finish, still running on its own, long after everyone told me to stop. The first thing you learn on a cruise ship is that the ocean doesn't care what time it is, and neither does the human body. I was 3 years into contract nursing when it happened, worked up from deck crew infirmary shifts to being the senior nurse on a ship that carried almost 4,000 passengers and maybe 11 medical staff for all of them. I tell you that number because it matters. 11 people for 4,000. That ratio is the whole story, really, if you want to skip to the end of it. It was 3 a.m. when the call came through, a cabin steward's voice cracking over the radio, saying a passenger had collapsed in the hallway on deck 9 and wasn't responding. I was already awake, charting somebody's blood pressure from an earlier fall, and I remember thinking, calmly, professionally, that this was just another overnight call, the kind you get 3 or 4 times a crossing. I had no idea that the next 6 hours would end my career. I got there before the doctor did. That was the first thing that didn't sit right with me. Dr. Aslan had been on shift for 19 hours straight. He'd handled a norovirus outbreak on deck 6, a broken wrist in the casino, and 2 panic attacks before midnight. And when the steward radioed him, he didn't answer for almost 11 minutes. I found him afterwards slumped in the staff break room with his glasses still on. Not asleep exactly, just gone, the way a body shuts itself off when it has nothing left to give. I didn't wake him right away. I told myself I could handle the initial assessment. That was the second moment, the quiet turn nobody notices until much later. The moment I decided I could do this myself instead of pulling him out of that chair. The passenger was a man in his 60s, gray around the lips, breathing in short pulls like he was trying to sip air through a straw. Textbook cardiac presentation. I started him on oxygen, got a line in, Chill called for the crash cart, and radioed the bridge to alert the captain we might need a medical diversion. Standard. Clean. I felt, for about 4 minutes, like the system was working exactly the way it's supposed to. Then I opened the crash cart and found half of what I needed wasn't in it. The epinephrine was there, but the second line of cardiac drugs had been pulled 2 weeks earlier during an inventory audit and never restocked, because restocking required a supply request that had been sitting unapproved in a shore office for 17 days. I stood there with an empty compartment, where a drug should have been, and understood, in one sick drop of my stomach, that the ship simply did not have what this man's heart needed. I woke Dr. Aslan. He came in disheveled, apologizing, and for a moment, having him there felt like relief, like the adult had finally entered the room. He ordered a substitute medication, something we did have, at a dosage he was clearly guessing at, because his hands were shaking too badly to read his own handwriting on the chart. I should have said something right then. That's the part that still keeps me up. Not what happened after, but that 4-second window where I saw his hand shake and said nothing. The passenger stabilized. His color came back, his breathing evened out, and for almost 40 minutes, I actually believed we'd caught it in time. I remember exhaling for what felt like the first time in an hour. I even radioed the bridge to stand down the diversion request. That was the cruelest turn of the whole night, because it wasn't a lie, it was hope, and hope is so much worse to lose than a false alarm. He crashed again just after 4 a.m., and this time it wasn't textbook, it was violent, his whole body seizing against the gurney straps. Dr. Aslan gave the substitute medication again, doubling the dose without recalculating for what he'd already given, and I only realized what he'd done when I went to log it, and the math didn't add up. 2 doses, stacked too close together, of a drug never meant for what we were using it for. I called the company's onshore medical line, the emergency protocol number we're told exists for exactly this kind of moment. A woman answered who was clearly reading from a script, and when I explained the situation, she asked me 3 times whether a diversion was operationally necessary before she'd escalate it, because diversions cost the company between $200,000 and $400,000 depending on the port, and someone on that call, somewhere above her pay grade, needed to sign off on that number before a helicopter got authorized. I sat there with a dying man in front of me while somebody weighed his life against a spreadsheet. The diversion never came. By the time the sun came up, the passenger was in a coma, stable on paper, but not present in any way that mattered, and I understood that we had lost him hours earlier, somewhere between the empty drug compartment and the stacked dosage, and no amount of oxygen was going to bring him back from wherever he'd gone. That should have been the worst part. It wasn't. 2 days later, a man in a suit I'd never seen before came down to the infirmary, introduced himself only as being from corporate, and asked to see the chart. He read it in silence, then asked me, very calmly, whether I'd be willing to update the discharge status before we reached the next port. I told him the patient hadn't been discharged, he was comatose, he needed a hospital, and a ventilator, and a team we didn't have on board. The man nodded like I'd confirmed something he already knew, and said the company's legal team had reviewed similar incidents before, and that the cleanest resolution, for everyone, myself included, was to log him as stable, treated, and released prior to arrival, so that his family could handle transport privately once ashore, rather than the incident going through the ship's formal reporting channel. I asked him what similar incidents before meant. He didn't answer that. That silence was its own answer, and it was the turn that changed how I saw every other night I'd worked on that ship. Because if this had happened before, then somewhere in the archive of logs I'd helped keep, there were other names, other families, other quiet transfers that had never once shown up as what they actually were. I went looking that night, after my shift, using credentials I probably shouldn't have still had access to. I found 4 other cases over 2 years with the same phrase, stable and released, attached to overnight cardiac or respiratory events, each one closing out just before a port call, each one with no hospital record on the receiving end that I could trace. 4 other names, 4 other families who'd probably been told their relative walked off that ship under their own power. I confronted Dr. Aslan the next morning. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a year, not just a night, and he told me, in a voice with no fight left in it, that he'd asked for a second doctor and a fully stocked cart for the 18 months he'd been on contract, and every request had come back denied or delayed, and that if he pushed too hard on staffing, he'd lose his position entirely, and then there'd be no doctor on that ship at all, understaffed being infinitely worse than one exhausted man doing his best. I understood his logic even as I hated it. That's the part that guts me now. I understood it. The corporate man came back the next day for my answer. He didn't threaten me outright. He didn't have to. He mentioned, almost gently, that nursing contracts in this industry run through a small handful of staffing agencies, and that agencies talk to each other, and that a nurse flagged for insubordination during a liability event tends to find her name harder to place going forward. He was telling me, without ever saying it, that my career could end quietly too, the same way this man's file was about to. I signed it. I want to say I fought harder than I did, but I didn't. I typed stable, treated, and released into a system that would follow that man for the rest of whatever life he had left. And I felt something in my own chest close over, the same way I imagine a wound closes over dirt if you sew it up too fast. We reached port before dawn. I wasn't on the transfer team, they made sure of that. Kept me on a separate deck doing intake for the next round of embarking passengers while 2 crew members I didn't recognize moved a gurney down a service gangway on the far side of the ship, away from the main terminal, away from cameras, away from anyone waiting with balloons, and a sign with his name on it. I found out later there had been a woman waiting at that terminal that morning. I don't know if she was his wife. I don't know if anyone ever told her which gangway to look for, or whether she stood there for an hour before somebody in a company polo shirt quietly pulled her aside. I tried, twice, in the weeks after, to find out what happened to him. I called the Port Authority's medical registry using the little information I had, his age, the date, the general description of his condition, and both times I was told that without a hospital admission number, they had no way to search, and that any patient information beyond that would require a request through the cruise line's legal department, which of course was the same department that had sat across from me 2 days after he collapsed and asked me to make him disappear on paper. I finished that contract. I finished the next one too, because I told myself the money mattered, and the work mattered, and somebody competent needed to be down in that infirmary, even if the whole system around her was rotten. But something had shifted that I couldn't logic my way back from. Every code I ran after that, I found myself checking the cart twice before I even touched the patient, not because it helped him, but because I was terrified of another empty compartment, another shaking hand, another form waiting to be filled out with a word that wasn't true. I left ship medicine 18 months later. I work in a land-based ICU now, where the drug cart is stocked and checked every shift by 3 different people, and nobody has ever asked me to write a word I didn't mean. I still think about him more than almost anyone else I ever treated, more than the ones I actually managed to save, because with those patients I got a name, a discharge, a family thanking me in a hallway. With him I got a file that says he walked off that ship on his own 2 feet, and a memory of a gurney disappearing down a service gangway at 5 in the morning, and nothing else. No hospital record, no obituary I could ever find with any certainty it was him. Just a chart, closed out clean, and a woman on a dock who may still be waiting for an answer nobody on that ship was ever going to give her. I got the job because I was quiet. That's not me being modest. That's literally what the recruiter told me. 6 months in, over drinks she probably shouldn't have been having with a 24-year-old subordinate. She said the last girl in my position asked too many questions about the expense categories, and questions were expensive. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The company ran a mid-sized shipping fleet, cargo mostly, some chartered passenger routes, and my job was simple on paper. Junior officer, admin division, based onshore. I processed contracts, filed incident reports, reconciled the numbers that came back from ships that were, most of the time, somewhere I would never see. The work was boring, in the specific way that makes you feel safe. Boring means nothing is happening. Boring means you go home at 6 and sleep fine. The first line item I didn't understand came about 4 months in. A wire transfer, $31,000, categorized under special settlements, crew welfare. I asked my supervisor what it meant, mostly out of curiosity, the way you'd ask what a word means in a crossword. He didn't even look up from his screen. He said it was compensation for an injury on the Rotterdam route, a deckhand who lost partial use of his hand in a winch accident, and that the company handled these things directly instead of dragging it through insurance, because insurance made everything slower and worse for everyone. That sounded reasonable. I filed it and moved on. The second one came 2 months later. And this time, the wording caught on something in me. Special settlement, family of, followed by a name, followed by an amount that was almost triple the first one. I looked up the name in our crew roster. He'd died 11 weeks earlier. The internal report listed it as a fall during rough weather, unwitnessed, no other crew present at time of incident. I remember sitting there for a long time, not because I suspected anything yet, but because there was something about the phrase unwitnessed at time of incident that felt like it had been chosen very carefully by someone who writes for a living. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as if I saw it coming, as if I fought back from day one. I didn't. I filed it, same as the first one, and I told myself that ships are dangerous, that men die at sea, that this was simply the cost of an old and violent industry finally being humane enough to take care of the families it broke. It was maybe 8 months in when a woman called the front office asking to speak to someone about her sister. Her sister had worked as a stewardess on one of the passenger charters. The receptionist, not knowing what else to do, transferred the call to me because I was the one who handled settlement paperwork, and the settlement paperwork apparently included a woman who was still alive and wanted to talk. She told me, in a voice that kept breaking and then steadying itself like she'd rehearsed staying calm, that her sister had been assaulted by a senior officer 11 months earlier, that the company had offered her $22,000 and a signed non-disclosure agreement instead of a police report, and that her sister had taken the money because she needed it and now couldn't stop crying whenever a door closed too loudly. I told the woman I would look into it. I did look into it. The file existed. It had my supervisor's signature on it. It had been filed the same week I started working there. That was the moment the floor tilted, just slightly, just enough that I noticed I'd been standing on something uneven the whole time. I started reading backward. Not investigating, not yet, just reading. Going through the archive I had access to as part of my normal duties, because nobody thinks to restrict a junior admin's access to old paperwork. We're the ones who are supposed to be filing it. What I found wasn't one pattern. It was 3, stacked on top of each other like they'd been built by different people who never had to look each other in the eye. Injury settlements, quiet ones, for accidents that were always unwitnessed, always during rough weather, always just severe enough to need money, and just ambiguous enough to avoid an investigation. Harassment settlements, always paid to women, always under $25,000. A number that I eventually understood was chosen because it sat just below whatever threshold triggered a mandatory report to the Maritime Labor Board. And then a third category, smaller, only 4 instances across 6 years, that I didn't have a name for yet, because the settlement amounts were so much larger, and the incident reports so much thinner, that I couldn't make myself finish reading the third one all the way through in one sitting. I told my supervisor I'd found some inconsistencies in the older files. I used that word, inconsistencies, because I still didn't trust myself to use a worse one. He said thank you for flagging it. He'd take a look, and then he moved my access permissions the following week, framed as a routine security update. I understood exactly what that meant. It meant I'd been seen. I could have stopped there. That's the part I keep coming back to, when I think about who I was for those first 8 months. I could have stopped there and let it become somebody else's problem, the way it had clearly become mine by accident, inherited from the woman before me, who asked too many questions, and was quietly replaced by someone who wouldn't. Instead, I asked to be moved onto the archive digitization project. It sounds insane now, offering myself up for more access right after they'd taken some away, but I framed it as ambition, as a junior officer trying to make herself useful, trying to get noticed for promotion. They said yes. Of course they said yes. I was still the quiet one. I was still, as far as they knew, exactly what they'd hired. For the next several months I copied files at work, and copied them again at home, a second time, onto a drive that never touched a company network. I read the 4th category eventually, the one I couldn't finish the first time. It was 4 names, 4 settlements, and 1 line, repeated with almost no variation across all 4 files, that said the crew member in question declined further onboard assignment and was released from contract at their own request. I cross-referenced those 4 names against the Missing Persons Registry for Maritime Workers, a public database I found almost by accident one night at 2 in the morning. 2 of the 4 had never been reported missing, because on paper they'd resigned. The other 2 had families who were still filing update requests every year, still asking a database that had no answers to give them any. I want to say I felt rage in that moment, something clean and motivating, but it wasn't like that. It was quieter and worse. It was the specific sickness of realizing that you have personally, with your own 2 hands, stapled and filed and reconciled the paperwork that let 4 families keep believing a lie, because the lie was typed neatly and the truth would have required someone to actually look. I didn't leak everything at once. I want to be honest about that too, because the version of this where I marched into a newsroom with a flash drive and my chin up isn't what happened. What happened is I sat on it for 11 more weeks, terrified, because I understood by then that the company had spent years building a system specifically designed to make people like me feel like there was nothing solid enough to hold on to, nothing you could point to and say, here, this is the proof. Every settlement had a signature that could be called routine. Every incident report had just enough plausible deniability sewn into the wording that a lawyer could spend a career unpicking it and still lose. What finally moved me wasn't a memo or a document. It was running into the sister again, the one from the phone call, at a coffee shop 2 blocks from an office she had no reason to be near unless she'd been waiting there, some mornings, hoping to catch someone from the company on their way in. She didn't recognize my voice from the call. I recognized hers instantly. She was still wearing her sister's watch. I noticed it because it was too big for her wrist and kept sliding down while she stirred her coffee. And I stood there behind her in line, thinking about the number 22,000 and the phrase declined further on board assignment, and I understood that I was never going to feel okay again until I did something that couldn't be filed away as an inconsistency. I sent the archive to 2 people. A maritime labor journalist who'd written about safety violations in the industry before, and a lawyer who represented families of merchant crew in wrongful death cases, someone whose name kept appearing, again and again, in the margins of cases the company had clearly worked very hard to keep from ever reaching a courtroom. I didn't sign my name to anything. I used an old email address I'd made years ago for something else entirely, something small and forgettable, and I sent it at 11 at night from a public library 2 towns over from where I lived, because by then, the fear had become a kind of muscle memory, something I did automatically, without needing to think about why. I don't know yet if it will matter. I want to say that clearly, because I think people want stories like this to end with headlines, with resignations, with someone in handcuffs on the evening news, and I can't promise any of that. What I can tell you is that the journalist wrote back within 4 days, and the lawyer within 6, and both of them used the word credible, which is a small, dry, bureaucratic word, but it landed in me like something enormous, because it was the first time in almost 2 years that anyone with actual power to do something had looked at what I was carrying and said, "This is real. This isn't nothing. You were right to be afraid." I still don't know how this ends. I resigned 2 weeks after I sent everything, gave a normal 2 weeks notice, packed my desk into one small box like nothing unusual had ever happened there. I think about the 4 names sometimes, and the woman with her sister's watch, and I don't know if what I did will get them anything close to what they're owed. But for the first time since that first $31,000 line item, I sleep through the night. I don't wake up at 3 in the morning replaying the wording of documents I signed off on without asking what they meant. I finally asked. It took me 2 years too long, but I asked, and I said it out loud to the only people who might actually be able to do something with the answer. 12 names. I counted them myself off the crew list that morning, standing on the dock with my coffee going cold, because that's the first thing you do before any voyage. Storm or no storm. You count. You check the list against the faces. 12 names, 12 faces, and we pushed off past the breakwater into weather that had no business letting a boat that size out of harbor. I'm not going to pretend I remember every detail clean, because that's not how it works when something like this happens to you. It comes back in pieces, out of order, And you spend years trying to lay the pieces flat, so they make a shape you can live with. So let me start where I always start, which is not at the beginning. Let me start with the part I can say without my hands shaking. The storm delayed the overnight watch by 2 hours, which happens, nothing strange about that. Deckhand named Marcus took the late shift with me because the man scheduled before him got seasick bad enough he couldn't stand straight. Marcus was maybe 26, talked about his daughter's birthday coming up, had this way of tapping the rail 3 times before he did anything, like a habit he didn't know he had. We split up to check the lines on either side of the ship. That's standard. That's not strange either. What was strange, though I didn't know to call it strange yet, was how quiet it got after I lost sight of him around the stern. I want to say I noticed right away. I didn't. The wind was doing something to the sound of everything, swallowing footsteps, swallowing shouts, and I finished my side of the check and figured he was still finishing his. I went back to shelter. I waited. 20 minutes passed before it occurred to me that 20 minutes was too long. Here's where it starts to bend. I went looking and I couldn't find him, and I did what you're supposed to do, which is report it up the chain immediately. Man overboard, initiate a search pattern, wake the captain. And the first officer I told looked at me for a second too long before he said he'd handle it. Not will handle it. He'd handle it. I remember that because it struck me wrong even in the moment, before I had any reason for it to strike me wrong. There was no search. I want to say that plainly, because I spent a long time not saying it plainly, even to myself. No search pattern, no horn, no lights swung out over the water. The ship kept moving. I stood on that deck in the rain, waiting for an alarm that never came, and when I asked again, I was told the situation was being assessed. By morning, the assessment was finished. 11 names on the roster. Not 12-1 with a note beside it. 11, clean, like the page had never held a 12th line at all. I went to the first officer with the old manifest still in my coat pocket, the one I'd checked against faces on the dock, and I asked him where Marcus's name had gone. He told me I was misremembering the head count from the day before, that we'd sailed with 11 the whole voyage. I told him I counted. I always count. He said maybe I'd counted wrong in bad weather, and he said it kind, like he was doing me a favor by not making a bigger thing of my mistake. That's the part that still gets me. Not that they lied gently, like the lie was a mercy they were extending to me. I kept the coat. I still have it. 12 names in my own handwriting on a scrap of paper folded into the inside pocket. And for a long time that scrap of paper was the only proof I had that I wasn't the one losing my mind. 2 weeks later I heard, secondhand, through a cousin of a guy who worked the office, that Marcus's family had received a settlement. Not a death benefit, a resignation payout, processed and closed, dated 3 days before we'd even docked. I want you to sit with that timing the way I had to sit with it. The paperwork closing out a man's employment was dated before the ship carrying him had returned to port. Somebody wrote that date knowing what it needed to say, before the rest of us even knew there was anything to explain. I told myself there was an innocent version of that. There wasn't. I looked for one for months and there wasn't. What broke it open wider was an old hand named Tomas, near retirement, who'd been sailing with this company for 11 years. I brought it up to him careful, the way you test ice, and instead of telling me I was imagining things, he went quiet, in a way that told me everything, before he said a word. Then he told me there'd been others. Not many. Enough. A man in 09. A man in 14. Always overnight watch. Always storm delayed. Always resolved before the ship made port again, with a name subtracted and a family paid to stop asking. I asked him why nobody had gone to the Coast Guard. He looked at me like I'd asked why nobody had gone to the moon. He said he had, once, back when he still believed reporting things did something. Filed it formal, with dates, with names. The report came back closed within a week. Citation for insufficient evidence. And the officer who filed the initial intake got transferred to a different port before Tomas could follow up. He said after that he stopped asking why and started just counting heads, same as I do now, because counting was the only part of it that was still his to control. I didn't want to believe that was where this ended. A man quietly accepting that the machine eats a person every few years and there's nothing underneath it but more machine. So I kept pulling. I found, buried in old maintenance logs I had no real business reading, a pattern in the insurance filings that lined up too well with the disappearances, cargo discrepancies, payouts on losses that never quite matched what should have been aboard. I'm not an accountant. I couldn't prove fraud. But I could see the shape of something using the sea and the storms and the ordinary danger of the work as cover for numbers that needed to move around in the dark. And I could see that a man going missing on a bad night was, to whoever built that shape, a convenience. I thought about going further. I thought about it hard, lying awake doing the math on what it would cost me. And here's the turn I'm least proud of, the one I circle around even now. I had a daughter of my own by then, and a mortgage, and a blacklist in this industry isn't a rumor. It's a phone call between men who've known each other 30 years, and I understood that if I pushed, I wouldn't disappear on a storm night. I'd just quietly stop getting hired. My family would starve slow instead of me disappearing fast, and I told myself that wasn't a real choice at all. So I did the smaller thing instead. I started counting out loud, at every departure, in front of everyone, making a show of it, tapping each man on the shoulder as I said his number, making it a ritual nobody could quietly step around. I told myself if I couldn't stop the machine, I could at least make it harder for the machine to work quiet. It worked. Some. Fewer overnight watches got assigned to men traveling alone after that. Not because anyone admitted why, just because I made enough noise about procedure that procedure changed a little around me. I never got an admission. I never got a body, a name restored, an apology, anything you'd call closure if you were writing this as a story, with an ending that resolves clean. What I got was this: I still work ships. I've worked them 15 years since that storm, and I've watched 4 more men rotate through that same company, under names I don't ask about anymore, because asking has a cost I've already priced out and can't afford again. But before every single departure, rain or clear sky, I stand at the gangway and I count. Out loud, every face against every name. And if the numbers ever come back wrong, I make it loud enough that changing the paperwork after doesn't stay quiet the way it did the first time. That's the whole of it. 12 names in the morning, 11 by night. Nobody asked why, except me. And asking cost me the last soft part of believing the people signing my checks were only in the business of getting boats from one port to another. I still get on the boats. I don't know what else a man like me is supposed to do. I just count the heads now, every time, before we ever leave the dock.